Hi, everyone. Our next unit in social studies class is going to be the Great Depression. Before we get started on our Great Depression unit, there are a few concepts that I'd like to cover with all of you. A few of these concepts and key terms will be showing up throughout our presentation today, and they will also come up during our class readings and activities in class throughout the next few weeks. Some of the few terms you need to be aware of include the stock market, speculation, Black Tuesday, Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, the Dust Bowl, migrant workers, Okies, Mexican repatriation, Franklin Delano Roosevelt or FDR, fireside chats, and the New Deal. The Great Depression started in 1929 and ended around 1939. So the Great Depression started when the stock market crashed in October 1929, and when World War II was ramping up and the U.S. started to get involved in World War II, that's when we were officially pulled out of the Great Depression. Before we get started on our key concepts, we're going to introduce a primary source. The next 3 slides are going to include an interview with a man named Mr. Tarver. He was a bank employee, and he's going to recall his memories of the stock market crash on October 1929, as well as his experience during the Great Depression. So please read along while I'm reading out loud to you. And then on the 4th slide, there will be some questions that you can answer. There were thousands who went down during the panic, lost fortunes, homes, business, and in fact, everything. I had not accumulated a great deal at the time of the panic, but I did have some savings and a good job. That was the trouble. My savings and my job went at the same time. Now that was the real trouble. Nobody but my wife and I knew just what we did go through. One morning, we 3 were at the breakfast table when the phone rang. It was one of the fellows who worked at the bank. Tarver, he said, have you heard the news? What news? No, I haven't heard any news, said I. What's it all about? Well, he said, hurry on down and see. If you will excuse the expression, when he said that, the seat of my britches almost dropped out. I felt like it meant trouble of some kind. I had had a terrible feeling of uneasiness over the bank for some time. Banks had been closing all over the country. There had been a run on our banks, some previous to that, but we tided that over, and since then it had seemed stronger than ever. I hurried down, and sure enough, in front of the bank there stood a crowd of employees, as blank expressions on their faces as I've ever seen. They were too dumbfounded to be excited even. The bank was closed, and I noticed that to that effect on the door. We stood there just looking at each other until finally one said, well, boys, guess we had better go on in the inside and see if we can find out what it's all about. I guess there goes our jobs. Not only my job was in the balance, but my savings were gone too, at least for the present. No one knows, unless they have experienced it, what it means to work in a place under such conditions. Of course, there were promises that the bank would soon open up and resume business and begin paying off. That gave the depositors something to hope for at least. The sad part was, this was the strongest bank in this town. In fact, there had already been several failures, so this was almost the only bank open for business. It was a national bank too, so everybody thought their money was safe. We worked on a while. To be frank, I didn't worry so much about my losses. I was so concerned about the other fellows. People were losing their homes and some of their savings of a lifetime. The saddest part of it was to see widows who probably had been left a little insurance and had put it all in the bank. People had a feeling that all connected with the bank, from the directors, president, on down to the lowest employee, are responsible for a bank failure, and that makes you feel bad. I haven't told you yet how the depression affected me personally. One by one, they began laying off employees, and I knew, sooner or later, my time would come. I didn't worry very much right then because I was young, and with my experience in standing in the town, I just knew I would not have any trouble getting work. I soon found out, though, I was mistaken in that. Well, my turn came to be laid off. On the desk one morning I found a letter to that effect. Of course it read with appreciation for my valuable service, deep regret, best wishes, etc. But that didn't help my feelings much. My job was gone and my savings too. I don't remember just how long I went without work, but it seemed a long time to me. Funds were getting mighty low, but we said nothing about it. My idea of stepping right into another job was erroneous. In normal times, I could have, but then there were no jobs to be had. Of course, I preferred work in my line, but soon saw I would do well to get a job at anything. I got a temporary job in the office at the ice plant. That didn't pay much, but it helped a lot. We counted our nickels, too. Fall came on and business fell off at the plant. I wasn't laid off, but I realized they didn't need me, but were just letting me stay on out of sympathy, and I couldn't stand that, so I simply quit. All right, so please take a couple minutes to answer these questions and pause the video so you have enough time to respond in your notebook. These are questions that we will go over in class tomorrow. First question is, how did the stock market crash in the Great Depression affect Mr. Tarver and other U.S. citizens? Second question, think about the U.S. economy in the 1920s after World War I ended. What were people's lifestyles like during this time? How might these lifestyles have contributed to the economic challenges of the 1930s? So again, for these questions, you're going to have to connect to our previous unit, and please pause the video here to take enough time to respond, and then you can hit play on the video to move on when you are ready. Okay, so to begin, how the Great Depression even came about, as we talked about, the 1920s were a great time of prosperity, and that allowed a lot of tech improvements to be made in factories, which then cut down on the amount of employees that companies needed. So they were replacing machines for people. The 1920s also had a great consumer boom, so there was a lot of product being made. However, they began to overproduce products. Not as many people were buying them anymore. So now companies aren't selling as many products as they need. Same thing with farmers. Farmers were producing a ton of food during World War I. 1920s, that maintained, and it started to slowly drop off until there was a food surplus and farmers weren't making the money they needed. Another key thing was speculation in the stock market. So stock market, one of our key terms, we'll go over it more in depth in class, but it is something where people can buy shares and investments in a company, and then as the company makes money, the person who buys a share also makes money, and people quickly turned to speculation as the stock market was rising in the 1920s, thinking they could make a quick buck off of the stock market. They were starting to buy stocks with shared money, and then when the stock market started declining, people now owed money that they didn't have to borrowers, and then that eventually led to a crash of the stock market, where people lost all their investments, all their money. Same thing with bank failures. People were taking out loans that they couldn't pay back, so the banks had no money. So banks began to fail as well. Let's take a quick look at just American society in general and what the experiences were of people throughout this decade of the Great Depression. So one thing to note is that the Great Depression had high rates of unemployment. If you can see, our chart from the U.S. Census Bureau starts from 1890 and it goes up and down throughout, but by the time we hit 1930, there was a big jump in the peak of the Great Depression around 1932, 1933, and then it starts to go down as we start getting some relief efforts that we'll talk about later with the New Deal. Drops way down 1945 when we get World War I. Like I said before, World War I really gets us out of the Great Depression, and then it stays kind of consistent through 2019. But we get that really big peak in the 1930s when we have the Great Depression. Hobos also became a thing in the 1930s. These were commonplace people getting on freight trains, trying to travel around, leaving where they lived, becoming a bit of nomads, traveling around to find where they could get their next work. Hoovervilles began to be established on the outskirts of towns. These were shanty towns, kind of put together little shelters, materials that people could just scrap up to get shelter because maybe they lost their homes. Again, maybe they were traveling looking for work. And it got the name Hoovervilles because at the beginning of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover was the president at the time. He was president from 1929 to 1933. So kind of a remark on how his administration handled the Great Depression, how the U.S. government was handling it at the time. Kind of got the slang term Hoovervilles for the name of these little shanty towns where people were living. African Americans in the Great Depression suffered from all of the general things that were previously mentioned, but they also had a few extra things that they endured that the typical white American did not go through. So in the Great Depression, many African Americans were sharecroppers in the South. So sharecropping was a concept we learned about previously, where African Americans were working on rented land for a landowner, typically renting the tools and materials, and after working that land and paying back what they rented, they could keep any profits. Typically did not keep any profits. In the Great Depression, this had severe debt. African Americans also worked in the industrial fields, in factories, but As everyone else, there was high unemployment, difficulties getting jobs. African Americans would be the first ones to get fired when it came to competition for jobs. So it just made their time a little bit more difficult than everybody else's. Similar situations with Mexican Americans at this time. So Mexican Americans in the 1930s were mostly in the Western United States. And again, as competition for jobs came up, Mexican Americans would be the first ones to be fired. They experienced all the other hardships that everyone else was experiencing, but on top of that job competition, they were the first to go. There was also the Mexican Repatriation Act, which came out in the 1930s, which basically led to raids on communities of Mexican Americans with the assumption that if you appeared to be Mexican or you were assumed to be Mexican, the raids would be conducted, and many of those Mexican American citizens would be deported to Mexico, even though they've never lived in Mexico, never were born there, not a part of it. They were U.S. citizens, but this really came about due to the competition for jobs and hoping this would open up jobs for other Americans. At the same time as the Great Depression is going on, we also get the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl is a big dust storm, happened for a long amount of time in the central part of the United States. So as you can see on our chart, it's really that central area of Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico that are hardest hit. And then it spans out to areas even as far north as North Dakota and Montana as being affected by the Dust Bowl. And this makes it really difficult for farmers. So dust storms come in, they cover all the land. Farmers can't work the land anymore. A lot of them lose their houses. And this leads to migrant workers leaving those areas to search for work elsewhere. Many of them go to California and other states that are further west, trying to look for a job again. As competition to work, there's a surplus of workers. Very difficult for people to make a wage that they can actually live on. Even just get a job that they can hold on to that's stable. So a lot of people are moving around based on different harvest seasons. It's a lot of farm work. And the term Okies comes about at this time too, kind of paying homage to the people from Oklahoma that came to California to look for these new jobs. The New Deal comes about when Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president, FDR, and this is kind of in efforts to fix what's going on with the Great Depression, try to get America out of the Great Depression. So, as I said before, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president. He starts hosting these radio broadcasts to try to connect to the American people, try to get them to better understand what the economic situation in the United States is. He's being very transparent with them about what the plans are, what the government's doing, what the state of the United States is. And so he really connects with them, and we get the coin fireside chats on these radio broadcasts because it happens in the evening. A lot of times when the family's gathered around the radio might be by the fireplace in their living room, listening to this, kind of being reassured and comforted about what the state of the nation is in. That made him very, very popular. And then again, during his presidency, his administration came out with many, many deals and programs that we will be talking about in class. So we're not going to go into depth here, but a lot of these New Deal programs dealt with employment and economic regulation. So this tried to create jobs for people so that they would have money. If they'd make money, they'd start putting money into circulation, into corporations and businesses, buying things, becoming consumers again. And then again, economic regulation through the stock market, banks, and other national economic corporations, trying to get that all under control as well. So that greatly helped the United States. And then it wasn't until World War I started where we got the end of the Great Depression. So when the United States militarized and we started needing people to make military equipment like planes and other weapons, that really contributed to the workforce. We had more people going into the military, serving overseas. So that all helped as well to officially end the Great Depression and get the United States out of the Great Depression. So hopefully you can look forward to a lot of interesting topics as we begin this next topic in our class.